This section is called Was There Class Today? Because issues of going to class, attending class, or not attending class are big issues of concern when you're in college. Let's start with a question. First, do you think most colleges have a universal attendance policy? The answer is no. Next, given that most colleges do not have a universal attendance policy, do I have to go to class? Well, this gets a little tougher because it really depends on what is in the syllabus for the particular class you have. Now, with regard to Psychology 100, or Intro to Psychology, some teachers, some instructors may have a policy that says you have to go to class, others may not. So you really have to read that syllabus and know what is their expectation. This still gets back to the issue of individual responsibility. The argument is, to learn, you must be in classes, because this is where you're going to get the information. And even if most classes there's no specific attendance policies for lecture, the argument is that you should go to class because that's where you're going to be able to learn. Are there any of you who have never missed a class, and now as seniors, you can say you've never missed unexcused? So you've never missed. You've always gone to all your classes.
Yeah, I pay for college too. I'm paying to learn. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to learn. You're going to teach me.
Right, so you want to be sure. Okay, you've missed one. I just remember, I just didn't miss. But I had the same view, like, God, this is money.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to waste
Throwing it down the drain. Back
to the question, should you go to class? We would argue you should go because there's a very high correlation between coming to class and your grade. And what this means is that the more you go to class, usually the higher is your grade. Next, another reason for why you should go to class. Reading the textbook is typically not a substitute for the lecture. There's going to be overlap between lecture and the textbook, but there are going to be many things that go on in lecture that are simply not going to be in the textbook. Next, getting the lecture notes from others is typically no substitute for being in lecture. There's simply too much that goes on a lecture that you can't capture well, very difficult to capture in notes. So you may get somebody's notes, but it really doesn't tell you what went on in lecture. Now keep in mind, with all this being said, some classes do have an attendance policy. And here's just an example of an attendance policy. An attendance may be taken through a variety of methods, such as a sign-in sheet, written assignments, or the use of clickers, which is a student response system that records your presence in class. Questions are asked and you just press this button. So there's a lot of ways instructors, even in very large classes, can take attendance. Another thing that you should keep in mind is not only do some classes have an attendance policy, some classes have a participation requirement. Now this is especially true in smaller classes, but even some larger classes will have it. So you have to be aware of that. It's another reason why you need to get to lecture. Finally, we should bring up that exam questions often come directly from lecture and not from the textbook. If you miss class, you may have no idea what an exam question is talking about. Again, you may think that getting the notes from somebody from class will allow you to know exactly what happened and you'll be able to answer the exam question, but just this simply is not correct. Now we should mention, especially for Psychology 100 that might have, again, Intro to Psychology that may have a lab, that for lab classes, attendance issues are typically the same. However, sometimes there is a strict attendance policy for lab, usually because you have fewer labs. And some classes include exam questions directly from lab activity and lab readings. So, you have to know the policies for attendance. We would argue that you go to lecture and lab. Now, once you're in lecture or lab, let's see how you're thinking about what goes on once you're there. Why don't you answer some of these true or false questions? When you go to class, do you talk to others in class during the lecture itself? Do you use electronic devices? Do you sleep in class? Do you read the newspaper or do other work? Do you not worry about arriving on time? Do you leave early? Do you start shuffling your papers and closing books near the end of class? We hope you realize it should be pretty obvious that all the answers to these questions are false. These are not things you do when you go to class. Instead, when you go to class, do not talk to other students in class during the lecture itself. This is unless your instructor says you can talk to your classmates, let's say during some group activity, you don't talk to others during class. When you go to class, you don't use electronic devices. There's a fallacy of this of the idea of multitasking, that somehow you can be texting and listening to a lecture with the same amount of focus and attention. It's simply not true. When you go to class, you don't fall asleep. Not only is it rude, but of course you're going to miss a lot of material that's going on in class. The same issue, when you go to class, you don't read the newspaper or do other work. You're there to learn. You don't bring other work with you. You do not read a newspaper. When you go to class, you arrive and leave on time. If you must be late, enter the room quietly and explain why you were late to the instructor. Do not leave early unless you have talked to the instructor. It's simply, again, there's a rudeness issue, but also keep in mind that if you come late or leave early, everybody's focused toward you, and it really ruins the flow and continuity of the lecture. Finally, when you go to class, do not start shuffling your paper and closing books near the end of class. The instructor knows when the class is supposed to end, and he or she will deal with that accordingly. It's more than the fact that you're not in high school anymore. The above behaviors, as I've said already, are simply rude and unacceptable. If you go to class and it's an interesting class, which is going to be up to that instructor, time will go quickly and you will learn.